It's extremely dependent. How does Europe fight as Europe? The answer is it can't. It doesn't. There is no structure for it to do that. The structure is through NATO, but really all that means is docking into a U.S.-led alliance where the U.S. provides everything. It does the command and control. It's a U.S. general. How does Europe think about defending itself? There is no European command. There is a U.S. European command that thinks about defending Europe, but amongst Europeans, that doesn't really exist.
Hey, it's Marcel Dirsus, and this is The Next Best. Putin is increasingly aggressive, Trump is unpredictable and often hostile, and the Europeans? They depend on the United States for their own security. But there might be another way. My guest this week is Max Bergmann, a former American diplomat who just wrote a report about the concrete steps Europeans need to take to defend themselves without the United States. Let's go. Hi, Max. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start by talking a little bit about history, because when we talk about the European Union, it's hundreds of millions of people. It's one of the richest places on earth, and yet it can't really defend itself, which is curious. So how did Europeans get themselves into this position?
Well, it's actually really interesting. I think you have to go back to the post-World War II period. And what's interesting about the post-World War II period is we sort of think the war ended, France and Germany got together, coal and steel community, let's bury the hatchet. What's interesting is the coal and steel community proposal isn't announced until May 1950, 5 years after the end of World War II. And what was effectively happening is that Germany was being rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, and there was this immense threat of the Soviet Union. The Soviets had detonated a nuclear bomb in August of 1949, freaking out the Americans. And so there was this huge question of what to do about a rebuilding Germany. How do you leave Germany disarmed? And I think the one key thing that everyone sort of forgets about this period is America wanted to come home. This wasn't really even a discussion. It was a conventional wisdom in Washington that American forces after the war were going to come home. Part of Yalta, part of the capitulation on the U.S. side to the Soviets, is that we're not going to be there to really push back. That's going to be the U.K. role. But by 1949, we start to realize, we can't do that. We can't just come home. Europe isn't just going to be rebuilt. And yet, so what we need to do is to figure out something else. NATO is created in April 1949, but what that is essentially a British plot to keep the Americans in. The Lord Ismay, the British general who becomes Secretary General of NATO, the founding quip of NATO is that it's to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. What he means by that is that America was going to leave. So this is a solution to keep us in, and therefore we keep the Russians out and we don't have to worry about the Germans. It's a solution to the German problem. And we didn't want that. What we wanted was to build the Germans up, build the Europeans up so we could come home. And what happens right after the Schuman Plan is announced in May 1950 is North Korea invades South Korea in June of 1950. And then suddenly there's discussion of a European defense community. And Washington goes all in. This is our solution, a European army, a pan-European army. Europeans unite together as one. Let's create a United States of Europe. That's great. Then we can come home. And it's only until 1954, when this fails, when this is a French idea and then is rejected by the French Parliament, that America realizes, crap, we have to just stay. We have to stay in Europe forever. And that's what happens. And so what happens is this illusion in Europe that they're sovereign when it comes to national defense, that all these individual countries in Europe have their own militaries and they're sovereign. But what these militaries do is then dock into the U.S. That is what NATO is. That's the structure that NATO does. And after the Cold War, the EU said, hey, maybe we'll create our own, European Rapid Reaction Force or your own army. And what does Washington do? We say, don't do that. We become opposed to EU defense. Exact opposite position of end of World War II, because we've got used to staying. So what's happened in Europe is that we want to be there. We were going to stay forever, it turned out. And you built your military structures around us, and you don't really coordinate with each other. You coordinate through us. So Europe is dependent in part because of the success of NATO, because that, in the end, is how we have wanted it really the past 35 years. And so I think it's whose fault is it? Well, Europe is underinvested in defense. Of course, we can go through all that. But it's really the United States that has been our post-Cold War strategy was to build European defense around the United States.
Yeah. And I guess in some ways it actually got worse after the Cold War, right? Because at one point during the Cold War, some of these Europeans had serious militaries. I mean, the German military during the Cold War at some points was a serious fighting force. And then it just atrophied after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, of course. And that is a huge part of it. And then, because look, if you're European, or if you're a European country, and you're like looking at the world in the 1990s to the 2000s, even the last decade, maybe, if you're not Poland or the Baltic states, you're like, there's not really a threat to us. We have the United States. They don't want us to bind together, to unite our forces. And so what would you be spending money on if you're Europe? Well, you're spending money on doing operations outside of Europe. And now you're just doing those, in support of the US in Afghanistan, some countries in Iraq. But you don't need to have this kind of expeditionary military that is going to be projecting power like Europe is a global power. And so that would be the only rationale to have really kept investing, is that Europe wanted to be this great global power. And instead, it was like, well, we don't really need to. U.S. demands for more European defense spending were not about you need to spend more so you can become independent. It was you need to spend more so you can help us out more, so you can provide more capabilities to us to help us do what we want to do around the world, whether that's Afghanistan, whatever mission it may be. And so I think there's a clear logic in why Europe wasn't spending. That was actually part of the bargain, frankly, with the United States. We accept your protection. We accept your direction in foreign policy, and we're going to have these militaries that are probably not going to be able to do very much.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think for a while it sort of worked well for both sides. But obviously now things are a mess. So just how dependent is Europe on the United States when it comes to defense?
It's extremely dependent. And I think you can break down the dependencies in sort of different ways. But I think what we have to recognize here is that one of the major dependencies is not about military spending. It's not just about the stuff. It's that how does Europe fight as Europe? The answer is it can't. It doesn't. There is no structure for it to do that. The structure is through NATO, but really all that means is docking into a U.S.-led alliance where the U.S. provides everything. It does the command and control. It's a U.S. general, a SACEUR. And in the beginning of last year, I went to NATO headquarters, and it struck me that if the administration, let's just say this is January or February of 2025, let's just say the administration announced it was pulling out of NATO. I didn't think that was going to happen, but who knows with this administration? How does Europe think about defending itself? There is no European command. There is a U.S. European command that thinks about defending Europe, but amongst Europeans, that doesn't really exist. And so I think that structurally becomes, one major problem that you identify. You can solve that. That means sort of top-down leaders. Okay, all these militaries need to get together, a leadership, to figure out what is the plan to how Europe defends itself without the U.S. And that's sort of number one. That structure is lacking. But then you sort of go down and the list, and what you see is that when it comes to telling Europeans who to shoot at, the intelligence, right? So the intelligence capabilities that the U.S. provides, where it's, hey, use your F-35 to target this force over here. When it comes to moving forces around Europe, they depend on U.S. transport, on U.S. air tankers. So flying gas stations, you have all these F-35s. Who are they going to dock into? The U.S. Defense Industrial Base, which is quite weak, actually. They were signing all these checks that they can't really cash, or they were accepting all these checks that they can't really deliver on in cash in a timely fashion. So if the Europeans start shooting off all their missiles on their F-35 and come back to America to get more, I don't know how long that will take. So they're dependent on the U.S. Defense Industrial Base. They're dependent on U.S. intelligence, dependent on U.S. enabling capabilities to be able to fight. And all these militaries don't really sort of structure and fit together. And I haven't even gone to the nuclear side, which is, the U.S. providing the nuclear extended deterrent to deter Russian action. So there's a lot of dependencies, but I don't think the way to approach this current problem is to say, my God, Europe is helpless. Oh my God, there's nothing we can do. So we have to just bend the knee, kiss the ring, and hope for the best that America will be there if there's a real catastrophe.
Hey, it's me. Apologies for the interruption. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and subscribe to the podcast. I've been told that it really helps, so that'd be great. Thank you very much. I totally agree. So let's go through some of those problems in more detail, and then let's try to figure out how Europe can fix them. I guess the most immediate contribution that Americans make to European defense is in the form of American troops in Europe with their tanks and armored vehicles and all the rest of it. So how many American soldiers are we actually talking about, and what do they do?
So the number of U.S. forces in Europe has declined significantly since the Cold War. It's even declined since 2022, 2023. I think there's now roughly around 80,000 troops in Europe. But what those forces would do, let's just say the Russians were going to come over the line in a Baltic state, is they represent the European Rapid Reaction Force, right? When you had U.S. generals thinking about how to defend the Baltic states, particularly after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, it was how do we get our forces from Germany into the Baltic states? But basically the U.S. would come with force and would be leading the fight. And then we would say, hey, Finland, what do you got? Hey, Sweden, can you fly over there? The U.S., to use maybe a European football analogy, is a little bit like we're the spine of the team. We're the center backs, the central midfield, and the strikers, and Europeans are sort of wingers or wingbacks or fullbacks, depending on whatever system you play. And they dock in to us. So it's that rapid reaction force that was really critical. And if you sort of remove that, you have a real problem. Germany is investing in its ground forces, so maybe it can play that role. Poland is investing in its frontline forces, so maybe it can play that role. But the thing that we try to point out to in this report is there's 100,000 people in the Spanish army. There's 120,000 people in the Italian army. Now, is that a force like ready to go? But those are people that have signed up to fight for their country, to potentially fight for Europe, and Europe needs to start leveraging its scale. Those armies are bigger than the UK army. So what I think I see right now is a lot of lack of creativity of like how you would actually put this all together. And Europe has people that are in uniform and trying to figure out, okay, maybe those forces shouldn't be on the other side of the Pyrenees or the Alps, but you bring them over and then maybe that becomes the core of a European response force. It doesn't have to be a European army. You can call it whatever you want. You can structure it in all sorts of ways, but why don't you take those people, train them, equip them, and that becomes something that can maybe begin to replace. And the other aspect here, which is really challenging, is NATO is structured on bringing all the Americans that are over in continental United States. We have a base in Norfolk, Virginia here, NATO base, Joint Forces Command Norfolk, to basically bring U.S. troops over. That would then be that follow-on force. So you also have to think about, well, if the Americans aren't coming in the follow-on force, how does Europe then keep fighting? How does Europe fight a war of attrition like the way Ukraine is fighting? And it requires really challenging how we think about how Europeans, sorry, not we, but how Europeans think about national defense and like how does this work? And I think it requires Europeanizing that thinking.
You mentioned creativity. I think that proposal for a pan-European force, some sort of joint combat capability, is a good example of that creativity. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what that would look like?
Sure. And let me just say, oftentimes you would hear, like, I'm sure that a lot of assumptions. I think there was an article or a proposal in Euractiv. We've heard a European army proposal again, and it's you can dismiss it. That's just not realistic. What I would also just posit is that Europe defending itself as 27 different separate distinct nations is also not realistic. There would be a degree of chaos. Multilateral warfighting is not easy. We saw that in Afghanistan and Libya. Even during World War II, US-UK coordination was always challenging. So part of the goal here is to reduce the amount of just haphazard coordination that you need. So the way this would, I think, essentially work is you would say non-frontline militaries or non-sort of, countries could opt out of this. So France, UK, probably, want to maintain their they have a global outlook, but non-frontline militaries like Spain, Italy, I think they're large countries, the third and fourth largest countries in the EU, as well as other countries like Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium. What are you doing with your armies? What is the purpose of this? So the idea would be maybe you take a portion of that force and permanently deploy it together with other European countries. That it's not just a force that shows up, trains for a week, goes home, and you do that every 2 years. This sort of rotational training force. So NATO has various constructs of this. The EU has sort of done this in the past with the battle group formation. And I think the lesson learned here is that if it's not a permanent standing force, it basically is kind of useless because okay, that brigade that is stationed, I don't know, near Madrid is going to be hatted as a European force. And then nothing really happens. But if you permanently station the forces, just as U.S. forces are permanently stationed in Germany, if you sign up for the U.S. Army, you may be stationed in Germany. So if you sign up for the Spanish military, well, you may be stationed in the Baltic state or in Poland, wherever you put this force. And then you would train with other Europeans. The idea is, I think you would try to make this a very high-ready force, i.e. a force that is ready to fight, equipped with common equipment. So that would be an issue. What are you going to equip it with? Maybe you use common EU spending to equip it. And that begins to be the kernel of what becomes the replacement of the U.S., right? That other European militaries could potentially dock into. And this would require a lot of compromises. It would require new structures. And this force doesn't have to be an EU force. I know everyone gets concerned about that, but it could be used by the European Union. It could be used by NATO. It could be used by a coalition of the willing. What you're doing is creating a force that is a collection of countries that would help govern its use, and the EU, as maybe helping pay for it, would help administer its use. And it would have a European command structure that could report to a higher European officer or could be used to defend Europe or fight as Europe. Europe has sort of created something with Frontex that is essentially a border force, that can augment national militaries. And that concept here is sort of similar, but with military power. Now, there's a lot of ins and outs. It can get more complicated. I'm sure there's, part of this is that military officers or ministries of defense would raise all sorts of concerns. But this is doable. This is not that, I think, in some ways, not as innovative as it actually seems.
I think our situation is really quite precarious. So I'm definitely open to revolutionary change. But being German, I feel like I have to sort of talk about the challenges and the problems and the downsides and things that can go wrong. And I guess the most immediate problem is going to be, okay, but who decides, right? I mean, Ursula von der Leyen is presumably not going to decide to deploy this force. So is it going to be the Spaniards? Is it going to be the Italians? What if the Spaniards say, yeah, it's a go, and then Rome says, no, it's not, right?
Yeah, and I think Europe has what we're getting at now is a political issue, right? So I think, what this report does is look at the military side. So then you get to the political question. And this is the exact same thing that actually happened in the early 1950s. It was like, okay, let's create a European army. But you can't just have a European army running around Europe with no political leadership or direction. So then suddenly it was like, okay, well, we need a European political community that would be attached to it to have some democratic legitimacy to direct this force. I think what I would say is, yes, countries would have to agree to deploy this force. I think Europeans underestimate, number one, their willingness to take direction from people that aren't from their country. That's literally what they do now with the U.S. Instead of Europe taking charge of its sovereignty when it comes to defense, they basically outsource it to America. So all you do is you turn to an American general. But think about it right now. If there was going to be a war and it's the Trump administration and a supreme allied commander, how much trust is there to actually take leadership from a U.S. general officer? I'm not sure there's a huge amount of trust. So I think that part is overstated in terms of who directs this. Now, how do you make the decisions? Who decides on how this force would deploy? I think you would have to create some sort of a European Security Council or something that would then make a decision to direct this force. And obviously, if countries have skin in the game, they would have a decision to make about this. I think the other thing you could do is look at pan-European recruitment for this force. I think there's a lot of people that would be willing to fight and join a EU force, maybe that wouldn't want to fight for their country. I also think there's a lot of candidate countries. Maybe you wouldn't accept people from Ukraine, but from the Balkans and other places that would say, okay, I would like to join a European military, and maybe in exchange I get an EU passport. That is something as an arrangement that has occurred previously. But I do think that what happens when you need to develop military power, that creates political questions about how that's going to be led, how that's going to be structured. And so, yes, so would Spain and Italy then have to make a decision about whether to deploy? Yes. But right now, America would have to make a decision on whether it's going to defend, act to defend the European Union. So there would be a element of trust here that this force would be used. But I think if you're going to develop it, train it, and that's its entire mission, and that's what's agreed upon, you begin to get into that place.
Yeah, I think part of the problem for Europeans is that we got very used to not thinking. So this idea of independence and of our decisions becoming more consequential can feel quite scary to a lot of people.
Maybe just a quick point there is it does strike me that part of what's happened at European foreign ministries across Europe is it became kind of economic promotion ministries, basically promoting whatever businesses that you have in whatever European country. This is true in Germany. This is true across that your embassies and wherever they are, their job is to promote European businesses. That same case with the US, but the foreign ministries themselves, and that became the major focus because at a European level, the foreign ministries aren't really as relevant anymore. So that kind of took a huge role away from them. And on the big geopolitical questions, well, that's where you turn to the United States. And so I do think there is this sort of muscle that has to be built. And this gets to the command structure, but also there isn't really a National Security Council type structure, not just in how do you make decisions, but also, what the US NSC does is sort of create a framework for decision making, is adjudicate, be like, address, start thinking about all these issues. What are the choices? What are our priorities? How do we push this forward? How do we weigh pan-European interests? The Commission does that on economic stuff, but they have not been empowered on the foreign policy. A clean solution would be to empower the EU High Representative, make them a foreign minister. I get the challenges involved. I think more of a hybrid approach on decision making, on foreign policy making is probably needed. But that's we should also be clear, that doesn't require like 10 years of effort. If there was a war, that could happen in a month, right? That's the sort of thing that I think when I think of dependencies and challenges, it's like that's sort of a bureaucratic structural problem. It's really big, it's really important, but could probably be solved in some ways more easily than the military dependence.
So to mention a problem that will probably take a bit longer to solve, procurement. You mentioned this in the report as well. Europeans spend a lot of money on their militaries, but they don't get a lot of firepower for it. So just how severe is this problem and how difficult is that to fix?
So on the one hand, it's not hard because it's just, you can throw money at this problem. Now, you want to throw money at it in the right way, but ultimately, the core objective now is to build magazine depth, is to buy lots of bombs, lots of things that can explode. So if the Russians were to come over, you can throw all sorts of things at them. The Libya operation where the US was trying to lead from behind, suddenly we realized, oh my God, all these NATO air forces basically don't have munitions. That was a huge problem, a huge challenge. So that needs to be addressed. That requires a lot of funding, and we're seeing that happen. It's also, there's a degree of inflation that is taking place where there's all this demand and companies don't really want to build a third, fourth, fifth production line. And this is where actually European parliaments need to get involved. They need to provide oversight. They need to be really checking how this money is spent, not because it's being spent in a corrupt way, but that what we have here is this, the way the defense industry works is it's private, it's for profit, that I think makes sense, but they only sell really to governments. So you don't really have this competitive market. So you need to approach the defense industry in a different way than you would maybe just a different private sector business. So allocating money, that's the easy part, and the Europeans are doing that. The other thing I would say is that Europe needs to begin to really integrate and build up its defense industries. And this is where NATO has utterly failed because NATO doesn't do this. NATO is not Europe's Pentagon. NATO effectively is Europe's combatant command. It is to run the war. And if you think about the US military structure, our combatant commands run the war. They're run out of CENTCOM, INDOPACOM, EUCOM, and that's what NATO's role is in many respects. But what NATO doesn't do is provide how do you build the force? What are the things to buy? How do you coordinate that? And so what we have is a total mess in Europe with countries having equipment, all their own national defense industries, buying equipment from whoever. And this makes sense. And what we see is when Europeans spend more, they cooperate less. Because if you're German or Danish, it's easier to not have to cooperate with anybody. The Danes don't have to get on the phone with the Italians to be like, what's your procurement schedule? How much money do you have? We're thinking about buying this. You just go out and buy it. It's great. It's wonderful. All the national MODs are loving this, and all the national defense industries in Germany and other places are loving this. What they fear is having to work together to integrate. Because then they, we're a national defense company. We have it really good. If there's all this EU money and then we have to cooperate, but then what if we get bought out by those big bad Germans or the French, or then we have, there's all these other concerns. And if you're a procurement officer at a Ministry of Defense, it's just maybe my job will be will be transferred to the EU. And to me, this is what the EU should be doing, because what the EU does is break down the national procurement regulatory barriers. That's what it does in every other sector, and facilitate integration that then actually reduces bureaucracy, even though you're creating a new bureaucracy, but you're actually reducing bureaucracy because you're spending more wisely in a more integrated way. And so that's what I think needs to happen here. And that's what we're beginning to see is the coordination of procurement, where you start having not just NATO standards, but this is what the Europeans are buying. These are the 3 types of tanks. These are the 3 types of munitions. And that leads to a lot more coherence, because right now, I don't understand how this is supposed to work. To just put this in a blunt way, that if there was a war and you were going to deploy Italian forces next to Estonian forces, next to German forces, that are all operating different equipment, that all then have different supply lines, logistics line, and you can't transfer munitions between them, between forces on the front, what Russia would do is find the seams, find the gaps. That, I think, really has to be addressed. And that means sort of getting European militaries on the same page when it comes to procurement.
When I read the report at various times, I was like, well, how's that going to work? Is that realistic? But like you say, I mean, the status quo does not work. The way that we think this would work in practice is also not realistic. Right. So I think in the way that we think about this, we don't think enough about the cost of inaction. We always just think about the cost of action. I also wanted to ask about those stockpiles. Oh, in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine again, there was a lot of talk about artillery ammunition in particular. And I guess this is one of the few things in which Europeans have actually made some serious progress since then. Can you get into that?
Yeah, there's been huge progress. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but the amount that Europe is producing when it comes to 155 artillery, I think surpasses the United States by far, and has been really impressive. One of the things that was shocking as the war was raging is there were shortages of gunpowder everywhere. Not just in Europe, but in the U.S., and you couldn't buy gunpowder, you couldn't buy explosives. Europe is starting to deal with this challenge, but it shows the limitations, not just on the European side, but on the U.S. side. So all of these things are beginning to be tackled. I'm not exactly sure what the numbers are in terms of, has Europe actually improved its magazine depth? Because what is happening is that things that are being produced are rightly going to the Ukrainians. And so that is the core focus. I do think that the next issue is really expanding long-range strike. That's slower, it's harder. I haven't seen as much progress there. The other area is expanding air defense production, and there have been real increases. But this is where I think Europeans are in kind of a bind, because Europeans operate Patriot missile systems. Patriot missile systems are fantastic. When I was with the U.S. government, I went to Poland and said, you know what? I was it wasn't just me, part of a U.S. Please buy Patriots. It's better. It's better than this French-Italian SAMP-T system that you might be considering, or whatever, European conglomerate it was at the time. And so Poland went with Patriots. But now you look at the back orders for Patriot missile systems, you look at the lack of interceptors that the U.S. has, the lack of batteries that the U.S. has. Right now, European countries all made rational decisions to go with Patriot and not invest in the French-Italian system. But that doesn't make sense anymore, because what you need is sort of both. You need to buy Patriots, but you also need to be building up indigenous European capability. And is the SAMP-T system as good as Patriot? I don't know, probably not. But it's also, when you don't get the investment, when you're not being used, you then don't iterate. You then don't get better. So what we have here is just a lot of short-term thinking in Europe about, we already have American systems, so we should buy that. But then when you look at the long-term dependency, if there's a war between Europe and Russia, and let's just say there's a war in the Indo-Pacific, you ain't getting any of our Patriot systems, because we would need those in the Indo-Pacific. And so we need to start thinking much more about production capacity in the event that everything goes to crap. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's the world we're going to be in. But you talk to China hands and they're like, well, yeah, Taiwan is a real possibility. There's a real possibility of the U.S. getting into a shooting war. It's not probable, but it's now becoming, something imaginable. And if that were to happen, what does Russia do? We have to think about that. And what you would want in Europe is an ability to produce own European systems. And that's also in our interest, because what we would want is if we run out of stuff and Russia, let's just say Putin has died and there's no more threat, we would then come to you and say, give us all your SAMP-T systems. That would be beneficial to the United States. So I think that's how we need to begin to think about the production problem, is that we need more of everything. And you can't just say, oh, we'll just go American and not European. There should be a European option, I think, for all of these systems.
Yeah. And I guess that's especially important because of the way that war would likely be fought against Russia, right? Because, I mean, if the Russians are good at one thing, it's taking casualties. So I suspect this wouldn't be the type of war where, everything is over in a week, but we might beat them back initially because we're better at using some types of technology, but they would keep coming, right? So we need a lot more of everything.
This is, I think, the terrifying lesson of Ukraine for European defense. Technological superiority. There is no doubt that if the initial wave of Russian soldiers, if they were to come across, let's just say that was the hypothetical, and there's no United States, Europe could muster a defense. It has, would have air superiority. F-35s would shoot. Then they would run out of munition. But they would kill that first wave, right? That first wave. But then what about that second wave? And we are in a war now where Russia has had 1 million casualties, has just been able to sustain an assault after an assault. And what the challenge is on Europe is both, how do you get people to the front to hold that line? How do you then augment those people as European forces attrit? But then also, how do you have the magazine depth to just keep destroying the Russians that are there? And I also think there needs to be an offensive element to this of, Kaliningrad is there. That strikes me as a real vulnerability. It's surrounded by European territory, also other Russian cities. So where Europe needs to, I think, really think about is how to structure itself for a long war of attrition against a hostile adversary that does have real capabilities and critically has this ability to die, has this ability to just handle so many casualties. And that, I think, changes the equation. Because the way I think NATO is thinking about this pre-2022 is, they come over and they're done. But I don't think that's the way it can actually be. You can actually think about it. I think there's enough to deter there from Russia from doing this. I'm not saying this is likely, but that is the war that militaries, I think, need to prepare for.
Dictatorships have a lot of disadvantages when it comes to war, but one of the big advantages that they have is that they have an easier time taking casualties because the public doesn't matter as much for the survival of the regime or survival of the ruler. So this is definitely an area in which the Russians are pretty scary. On the intelligence side of things, you've suggested the creation of something called Euro-eyes. What would that be, and how would it differ from something like a European CIA?
Who is the coordinator of European intelligence collection? It's the United States. Europeans coordinate with us. We then analyze, process it, mush it all together, come out with analysis. And so we have become the major coordinator of European intelligence. Our CIA acts as Europe's CIA. What's amazing about Europe is that you have great intelligence services that really understand Russia. All the Baltic states, the Nordic states, Germany has a large intelligence service that's quite adept. The French, the UK, the UK is one of the world leaders. But the interaction is just not, it's ad hocery. And right now, our director of national intelligence is Tulsi Gabbard, is someone who has, visited Assad, is deeply skeptical of Europe, is an admirer of Vladimir Putin. So I don't quite know how the intelligence sharing is going with the United States. But I think what is clear is that if Europe is going to fight alone, well, then you need to coordinate your intelligence services. And so I think, beginning to do that with kind of a informal process, or informal, but maybe formalized with sort of a Five Eyes for Europe eyes, where, you can, if a country like Hungary is not trusted, you don't share intelligence. It's maybe outside of the EU. but maybe parts of it could be included inside the EU. There's all sort of ways to have something be EU, but without it being EU. But I think what you would want to build is something like a central intelligence agency. This isn't necessarily to do operational tasks, but this is just to coordinate information, to sort of get everyone on the same page. Maybe there's very few people that are actually in the European leaders that actually have access to this. But this is where Europe needs to go. And there's precedent because, this is what had to happen on the police side, on the domestic side, in part because of the domestic terrorism threat. You couldn't have it so that like the French and the Germans or the French and the and the Estonians or Poles weren't coordinating on who was crossing their borders, who was coming in, because the terrorist threat was very real to Europe. And that all had to be coordinated. So Europol is created to act as sort of a coordinating body and on the domestic intelligence police side. And I think that is something that is needed. And I don't think there's like Europeans would freak out about this. The one other thing I would say on the operational side, though, is that if Russia is engaging in a hybrid war against Europe, which is very much the case, you as Europeans needed to retaliate, right, in the kind of spy wars that are taking place. Right now, you rely on the United States to effectively do that, or you had relied on the United States, especially during the Cold War, to engage in the tit-for-tat spycraft, where if you're going to, hit us, we're going to hit you back kind of thing, in the operational side. How does Europe do that? Right now, it's just individual countries sort of doing stuff that then could cause an escalating crisis that isn't really coordinated, isn't really integrated. And I think that is part of the problem. It's hard to use the intelligence services in Europe as signaling effects to Russia about capabilities that you have that then deter Russia from doing certain things to Europe. And that is part of why Russia just sees it as open season, because how is Europe going to really retaliate? And I think there would be a mess if all these European countries start retaliating, because then that would be like, well, you can't deter all these countries. I think intelligence is an area where you have to begin to coordinating. And so once you start integrating on the military side, you see political intelligence. This is where the trend line begins. But that's the reality of if you're going to reduce the reliance on the United States.
I think it's fair to say that some of these discussions have taken on more urgency lately. So I just wanted to ask, sort of, how do you see the overall state of US-EU relations at the moment?
I think they're very bad. I think they're bordering on catastrophic. They're bordering on a real rupture. And I would distinguish between US-European relations and US-EU relations. I think with the EU, the administration has decided to effectively declare a hybrid war against the European project. I mean, that's what the national security strategy that was released suggests. There's a huge effort to support and back the far right in Europe's far right civil society groups, far right political parties. I think we're going to see a lot more U.S. funding going into that. And why? Because the administration wants to break European unity, break the EU. So I think tensions there are going to really escalate. And I think with European countries and with NATO, I think relations are very bad. And I think what has basically happened is that the United States has now gone back to where it was, to go back to the beginning of this conversation, says we want out. We don't really want to be protecting Europe. We don't understand why we're still doing it. U.S. has really not paid a lot of attention to NATO in 25 years, or since pre 9/11. There's very little understanding of how NATO works, why we're still there. We describe NATO, or at least we have in Washington, as a NATO priesthood inside the State Department, i.e. it's sort of you leave NATO to them. Everyone else just sort of doesn't quite understand what actually happens there, because it hasn't mattered to us. We've been focused on the Middle East, China. So, and that's true for Washington in general, but then you get MAGA that has the Trump administration, the MAGA element that both has an ideological dimension, but also just doesn't get why we're there. So I think where we're headed is the United States does not want to defend Europe. And I think the comment that everyone should have looked at the NATO summit last year is when Trump was asked about Article 5, he said, it depends on your definition. And he's right. He's right about what Article 5 entails. It doesn't entail it doesn't require the United States to go to war to defend Europe. That's the way we perceive Article 5. But it actually just, we could adhere to our Article 5 commitment and support Germany if it was being attacked by Russia in the same way we're supporting Ukraine. And I think that's where we're headed under this administration. And I don't think there's a follow-on Biden administration that's going to return America back to its Europe policy of the 20th century. I think we're going to continue, and Democratic administration would be much nicer about this, but would be all about European strategic autonomy and Europe defending itself more. So I think that's sort of where we're headed. But there's real danger of a real rupture. Greenland was avoided this week in Davos, but who knows what's coming next? There's going to be something else, and I think that tension is only going to increase.
Given the scale of the challenge and given the hostility of the White House towards Europeans, how well or how badly do you think European leaders are handling this?
So look, I think Europeans are super hypercritical of themselves, oftentimes rightly. European action is never as strong or as fulsome as it should be, but that's because it's hard, because it's very hard to move what is a nascent federal system forward. It is hard in the US to pass any sort of domestic legislation. And it is hard in Europe to do any sort of thing at the kind of EU level that represents a real shift in how Europe approaches the world or approaches its sort of governing structures. So I actually think if you look back on 2025, it is the year that Europe took charge of Ukraine. Europe financing of Ukraine came good, both at a national level, and then we saw at the European Council summit at the EU level, with the EU announcing that it was going to borrow money for Ukraine. It was going to do Euro bonds for Ukraine. I think that's a huge step forward. The EU also effectively permanently froze the Russian assets, even though they didn't access them. They made it so Hungary can't take that as a hostage anymore. That's a big step forward. And I think what we're seeing is that European states are recognizing that they have to band together, that operating individually, it doesn't really work. So I think what we saw, 2025 was the year to try to bend the knee, to try to get the United States to just, to simmer tensions down. And what we saw at Davos, I think, was Europe finally standing up for itself and it working. And it being quite effective, and that Europe actually has this latent power. So I think what I expect to see is more initiatives, more things done. I think we're going to see more on the European competitiveness side, which is important on the defense side. I think we're going to begin to see a conversation about how European defense structures, European foreign policy structures, I think will accelerate this year. The other thing I should say is the EU found 150 billion euros to spend on defense. And they did that over the U.S. objections last year. The U.S. was not for the EU finding money for defense, but they found it. And I think this is going to accelerate. I think where we'll be next year in 2027 is Europeans saying, man, we haven't done anything. We need to step up. We need to wake up. But then I could also list this whole, give you a whole list of big initiatives that the EU has done. And the question is, the fear is that while Europe is moving now in the right direction, it may not be moving at the pace needed for a potential conflict with Russia, a potential rupture with the United States. And so that is the cause for concern, but that is also the cause that is what is going to drive this forward in more action. So I think European leaders are generally almost totally united on this. Yes, there's Hungary, but you have 26 or 25 countries. You have 420 million of the 450 million people in Europe that are kind of all on the same page. That is tremendous. And I think that means that we're going to see a lot of action. We are seeing a lot of action.
I'm going to end here because it's nice to end on a hopeful note for once. So thank you very much for joining, Max. That was super interesting. And yeah, it did give me a lot of hope.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Click here to subscribe so you don't miss my next video. And if you want to see more right now, there you go. Either way, I'll see you soon.